I don't even know. So one of the troubles is I don't know where these are going to be stored.
Well, you're using your computer, right?
Yeah.
So it'll probably be saved in some kind of like a. Oh dang, that's a good call. I don't know because you're recording through Zoom.
Yeah.
Well, guess we'll just find out.
Yep, pretty much. Just find out.
Hopefully not on a cloud. That'll probably be a pain to download, but maybe not.
Sometimes that's the problem. Let's see here. My computer's also gonna die, so I have to have it plugged in.
What?
Well,
Yeah, have it plugged in, man.
well, it is, but I wish I was closer to the wall. Plug is, yeah, is a pain. Yeah, not too bad, I guess. Not amazing, but but not too bad. Yep. Right? I don't know. It's whatever.
Oh, sounds good to me. I mean, part of me is like, we'll figure out how much we get done right now. Part of me is like, I'd love to just roll and do different topics. Maybe even we'll see.
Yeah. So I have a topic for today, though.
Yep.
I have a topic for today. It is. I don't actually know if I told you that I'm even doing this, but it is on the central even idea of having these discussions and stuff like that. So I have started what I am calling the Intellectual Symposium. Okay. And it essentially, to me, the idea is creating the space for people to have all sorts of discussions, right? Somebody can go ahead and present their idea, whatever it is they want and stuff, and then other people, we can weigh in on it and have
we can tell them whether they're stupid or it has merit.
Yeah, regardless of some of those things, right? And I've even thought about, so because some of the pushback has always been like, well, yeah, that's cool, as long as it's in orthodoxy, or as long as it's in, and to be honest, I'm like, no, I don't care. I don't care if somebody comes up here and wants to preach heresy. And the reason I say that is a couple fold. Number one, it's like, is it okay if somebody's going to bring heresy, then fine. It's up to the other Christians to bring the response, right? The core principles I'm sort of working on still, but to me, part of the core principle is what I'm going to call the Sutton Principle. All right. It's from my dear friend, Andrew Sutton. All right.
Okay.
And it's this whole notion, he was always pushing back on this notion about arguing and fighting amongst Christians. And I was always kind of pushing back a little bit on him because I was like, dude, we have to argue. Like, we have to argue about things, right? Because we just can't, you can't tell the other person, you just need to accept my view, right? Like at some point, it's like, you just can't do it, right?
Well, let me give you my analogy on that, which I think will be helpful, because obviously the Bible does warn about, avoiding pointless quarrels, right? But there's theology and different things that matter that we should be arguing about because we should be seeking to find the truth. But the way that I think about it is the whole iron sharpens iron, right?
Yes.
You got two raw materials of iron. In order to get them sharp, there's going to be a ton of friction, right? Mm-hmm. You got to keep going till it eventually becomes really, really smooth. But you're going to start with a lot of friction. Even when they're smooth, there's going to be sparks and other stuff. Yeah. I think the idea of like everyone just agreeing doesn't make sense.
Yep.
And we have to be able to talk about the things that matter. And there's a lot of different issues that matter, even that are secondary issues. Secondary issues still matter. So I agree with you. I think conversations need to happen.
Yeah. So now the one thing that I finally, because he's kind of an external processor a little bit. So I was kind of helping him mold and shape, because it would be like some things would be like, no, like I can't agree with you there, because it's just going to lead to universalism. Like if you're too loose with everything, it's like, well, let's just be more accepting and stuff like that. It's like, no. But it was never quite what he really meant. And so I finally got him to boil down is like, what he really meant is the attitude of other believers, and that we should always have a loving and caring attitude when having these conversations. And that part is the part that I want to say, we should all be able to agree on. We can disagree 100%, but you should not have an attitude of malice or hatred towards the other person.
That should definitely be true. There should be no malice or hatred. I think one of the important things is something that's not necessarily moral, but dealing with civility, period, right? Like,
right.
Civility doesn't have to necessarily be a moral thing. There's things that break civility that obviously is not moral. But you deal with a certain amount of civility with people as a way of showing respect in different things. But it also avoids lots of times being, at least acting out hateful. But
yeah,
the issue is when you have a heart issue, it's likely to come out anyway. I mean, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks, right?
Yeah,
so they're definitely, I agree with them, but it's hard not to be passionate, especially if it's in regard to something that matters, like all the soteriology, all the salvation stuff. I totally get why people get really passionate about it and why they want to argue about it, because it doesn't get much more personal or the stakes much higher than salvation.
Sure.
But when you are willing to hate someone over the disagreement, or as they say, cast someone out of the kingdom because they disagree with something, that's a
well. And so you know what though? So here's to me part of the thing, right? So you mentioned earlier, like this, okay, iron sharpens iron. Yep. Love it and stuff like that. And not to quarrel over frivolous things. Yeah, I definitely get that. But I also think that I want this to be a space where we can talk about things that aren't as important.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
So like that we can just, for some things, enjoy thinking about and hypothesizing about things that really don't matter that much. Yeah. Like,
was the Batman better than Dark Knight Rises?
Well, and how is that related to Christ rising again? Because when the Dark Knight rises, I mean, is that really symbolism for, him coming out of the death that he endures in the cave and being there for a few days, right? So he's finally resurrected in the end.
Is the Batman really about one man trying to take on the sins of the city?
Yeah.
So, yeah, is it a microcosm of something much deeper and bigger?
But like giving even a biblical example that also could be ridiculous. Why is it so significant that Ehud is left-handed? Right? And maybe there is a real point to be made there, right? Or maybe there isn't. I don't know. But I think that's something that was like, hey, like if somebody wants to talk about it and they've got all these arguments for why Ehud being left-handed is super important or shows some sort of significance, fine, let's talk about it.
It at least lets some left-handed people know that they're represented, although that might not be the best person to be represented by.
I'm a little more worried of left-handed people after that.
Yeah, I think,
but only in the bathroom.
Well, after our cousin, as he rightly said, left-handed people are genetically superior. That's what he said. I'll let him have it. I'll just maybe I'll disagree, but I'll let that go.
Yeah, but I just think, like, you know what? I think that today things are worse and worse and worse in the regards that there aren't places to have an open discussion, including in churches, seminaries, colleges. I don't really care. Everyone already has their own ideas and ideologies that they want to teach and preach, and I'm all for it. It's like, hey, look, if you're a school and you want to teach a certain ideology or a certain theology and stuff, do it there. But if you want to come and bring that to the open forum, then come and bring it to the battlefield. Train in whatever space it is you want to do. But if you want to see how it really matches up, let's have a real discussion.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, because it's one of the things that I mentioned to you before, that I'm frustrated in sometimes my limited ability to interact with people. You watch different people online and you're like, man, it's so cool. And you might have a thought or a point or an argument. But for myself, when I'm watching someone, I'm like, man, this is the argument I would use. I just have no idea if it's a good argument.
Yeah. You want to try it out.
I haven't been able to present it to people that are knowledgeable enough to give a good refutation towards it. So, what you think is smart, when you're coming from your own perspective, it's hard to judge how strong an argument is until you run into someone who's thought about and comes from the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
So I appreciate that type of thinking. I think there's a lot of different things that contribute, especially in the Christian circle. I think we are afraid to disagree with each other on a lot of stuff. But also there's people definitely, we are, as you mentioned, there's maybe some people are a little bit fragile in regards to like disagreeing with each other, and it's the people skills that we lack nowadays, being able to be like, oh, you believe that, and like that's really stupid, doesn't necessarily mean I think you're stupid. Me saying an idea you have or like that thing is stupid. Now obviously I could say it nicer than that, but my point is we're in a place where it's like, well, I think this, and if it's wrong, then it means something really bad about me, rather than going, okay, my goal is to have truth, right? Like, if I want truth, then I'm willing to learn and interact with stuff. And more so for Christians to be able to say, to have the faith saying that they're willing to go into conversations and to learn and to grow, because the truth should be able to support itself, to
exactly. No, exactly. And that is one of the biggest points that I feel like is really, really huge, is I'm thinking of this much more almost, as a battle arena. Like it's a battle arena. And I totally get, like, for those that are younger in their faith and stuff like that, this is not necessarily the place for them. Like, it's really not.
Not to maybe discuss, but maybe to be able to listen, right?
Yeah, potentially it could be to listen and stuff, but let's just say that you're the pastor, right? You're the pastor of your congregation, and some of the people in your congregation are much weaker in their faith. It's up to you. It's kind of your judgment call and stuff like that. And I'm just going to say, it's like, I'm not going to put it out there as like, this is kid friendly, for all ages or whatever you want to say.
For sure.
And I don't mean that as like children, but I just mean like as far as believers and stuff like that, because I want to be able to talk about whatever controversial thing. I don't know if you're familiar with Dale Tuggy, right? Dale Tuggy, he runs the Trinities podcast, and he is a monotheist. Okay. He does not believe in the Trinity. All right. And he's devoted a ton of time, energy, space, money, whatever, to arguing against the Trinity. All right.
Interesting.
And he is super articulate. And I've definitely learned a lot from him. I actually love his show. Really, really fascinating stuff. And I totally can understand, like, he will definitely change some people's minds, so like, I understand if some pastors are worried and don't want to expose whatever their people to that and stuff. But I do think, it's the principle of, how do you overcome bad theology or bad speech? Well, with more theology and more speech, and I do think it's on other believers to defend your view. If you think you're right, then okay, make your argument stronger. And I do think it's heresies that bring about better theology.
Well, C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, I think it is, has the famous quote, and one of the guys I listen to uses it all the time, but it's, good philosophy needs to exist if for no other reason than to correct bad philosophy.
Yeah.
So, and maybe I'm butchering that quote, but that's essentially the meaning and what it says. And so there's a degree to where you're like, why do we need to study this? Why do we need to study this? And it's because bad theology and bad philosophy is out there, right? And so you do need certain people championing certain topics. And I do think, there's certain areas in scripture that people in certain walks, or maybe even just certain types of people, don't need to delve super deep into. Mm-hmm. And so, like Paul talks about the immature believers needing, still needing milk rather than working on meat. Mm-hmm. There is a time in a Christian's life to where they do need to soak in the basics. And I think the things that are very basic in scripture, we're constantly growing in a deeper understanding what they are anyway. because even though they're simple, the depth of understanding them is still something to behold. So we should constantly be growing in even the fundamentals of how much we appreciate them. But there's certain things, in a classic example that they always say is, when you lead someone to Christ, the next week, you typically don't want to be teaching them your view on the rapture.
Sure. Yep.
It's just like, it's not important. They need to have a fundamental thing. Overseas, they talk about different missions areas, China, other places that after the church started getting established, but it's still early in the church life in these different countries, they started sending specific doctrinal issues that were specific to and then they started fracturing churches all over the place.
Yep.
Now you've got the Paul and Apollos type thing. Wait a second, you got, you Christians in our country are following this belief. Well, we're following this belief, and I think there's a maturity we need to be able to have as Christians to be able to, on a lot of the issues, be able to walk together. I think there are a couple that I understand separating on. But there's a lot I think we could walk hand in hand in, and that comes from being able to have mutual respect for each other.
Yeah. Well, and part of the point again about this is and it'll depend Christian by Christian, because some Christians, of course, they just don't want to associate with other Christians, right? Or other, to them, so-called Christians. And to me, the point is that in this conversation, this dialogue and stuff, it's like, okay, look, I'm just not as interested in trying to vet everyone. Like I'm not sure what the boundaries will be, because at some point, like, it's like, all right, well, I'm not going to sit here and just argue about absolutely nothing interesting, but right. So I don't know what will be the exact right things, but at the same time, like, I want to leave lots of room for discussion, and I've held and made up several arguments that are unpopular for various reasons. And of course, like, some arguments that don't really matter that much and stuff. It could get other people riled up because they're like, dude, why are you talking about this? But
I already told you, which is not a biblical argument necessarily, but I told you my twin theory that was just a random idea. I've never run into an idea that is less appreciated than that. Everyone's like, they can't be. It's stupid.
Which one's the twin theory?
Okay, so anyone who, when this goes viral, which obviously it will, because how could it not? No, but if anyone's ever listening to this, don't hate me for this. But this was an idea. This was a random idea that I just had. I'm not saying I necessarily believe it. I'm saying it was an idea. And the idea is that it starts with the premise that life starts at conception, and that a soul is given at the point of conception. And so conception, you're given a soul.
Yep.
So you have certain twins that start as one being that splits. Okay. So the theory is that it's actually one soul amongst two different bodies. It is not given a second soul or two souls at the conception. You have different times where it's literally two, getting started at once. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about specifically where there's the split. And I would say that, maybe it has to do with the fall, and you just have, genetic thing happening. You have a split, and you have two different bodies that are created, but you had one soul that was given. And it is a complete random thought that is put out there as a way to explain some of what's considered supernatural phenomena that happens with certain twins that are separated at birth, because you would have two different bodies that are connected by a soul. So that was a theory that I threw out there that I just said, hey, I just thought this was interesting. I thought of it, never heard anyone talk about it before. And I've never heard anyone that I've just given that thought to be like, oh, that's interesting. Or they're always like, no, that's stupid. So you're trying to say they're not a person. No, I'm saying they are a person. But they're one person. Like, they're one person. And they're like, no, because there's two different bodies. I said, well, hold on. I was like, if you started donating parts of your body, how much, at what point are you saying it signifies another person? I'm just trying to say that if you had a genetic abnormality where your body could grow another body, have you created another soul? This is one of the stupid things with Wolverine and other characters in comic books where they're like, well, he regenerated based off of a drop of his own blood. And it's like, well, one, that's stupid because he gets bleeding all the time, right?
Mhm.
So literally there should just be Wolverines popping up everywhere. Well, he could regenerate from just his arm. Well, then if he loses his arm, his body should regrow the arm, and the arm should regrow a body, right? It doesn't.
Yeah.
The whole point is, if one soul is given at conception, it could be two because God knows the future. I'm not saying it has to be that way. It's just an idea and a thought. Then you potentially could have one person that, due to the fall and genetic things happening, having two bodies created and a soul being attached to two different bodies.
So, what's kind of funny is actually I was listening to Jeremy Boring, and he was literally just talking about when is a body ensouled. That was the discussion.
Interesting. What did he say?
He
okay,
didn't
I'm
really
gonna get smart alecky. Okay, I'm holding.
He didn't really have an entire answer and stuff like that, but they were talking about different things and stuff, and he said that would be like the real question. Largely would be like when.
Yeah, because that affects what your view on abortion probably should be.
Well, which of course is what they were talking about, right?
Yeah. Okay. So exactly. I knew it had to be linked to that, because I'm like, that's one of the debates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah, there's plenty of interesting arguments and things to talk about and stuff. And yeah, I also, of course, I want a platform to try out ideas. I remember a friend asking me one time, so which one of your ideas is the most controversial? And yeah, I pretty much just said, well, I don't really know, because a lot of them I haven't got to try out on enough people, right? So without getting to try out enough of the ideas, it's tough to say which one's the most controversial.
Interesting. But you have a couple that you're like, oh, these are my controversial ones.
Oh yeah. Well, I would definitely say, I mean, there's a few, and so of course my view and talk on omnipresence, God's omnipresence, pretty controversial. It's less significant, but it's controversial. People fight me on it all the time.
It's only me and you have talked about this. And you have talked about this very thing. So it just depends on how you define stuff. I feel like there's a lot of controversy on how you define stuff. You know, because one of my big things is the speaking about Calvinism and being a non-Calvinist and arguing with certain thoughts there.
Yeah.
It's kind of like, well, I have a controversial issue because I believe in sovereignty. And it's like, what do you mean sovereignty? So the debate is on what you mean by that. And I think that's what happens is when you're like, well, how, God's not necessarily omnipresent. And it's like, well, what do you mean by not being omnipresent? Like, he is omnipresent. It's like, but how you account for that, what you mean by that, I think it's just interesting. It's a definitional argument.
Well, so I'm getting the words a little bit stronger, hashed out. So this is what I would say. I would say I think we should no longer use the term omnipresence. That would be probably one of the stronger ways. And then of course, a lot of my arguments are just going to fit into why I think we should no longer use that term.
Give me one of your reasons why you think we shouldn't use omnipresence anymore. Because I'm wondering, because to me, I'm like, what's the purpose of not using it?
Because I think it's confusing.
An argument for.
It's confusing, and it gets the average layperson to think incorrectly about God.
Okay, expound on that.
Yeah, because the average person thinks, okay, God is omnipresent. He is everywhere, and he is in everything. Therefore, their concept lends itself closer to pantheism than it does to this idea of God being omnipotent and above everything, rather that God just is in everything and everywhere.
See, this is the debate. And because I would need to talk to more people, non-believers on omniscience. I don't know if it would lead to that.
I think it does.
See, I think that's the difference, is because obviously if you're taught pantheistically that God is everything, not necessarily just in everything, but God is those things.
Yep.
Because if you describe God as, depending on your view on his interaction with the world, you have some people who are like, well, the one verse that talks about he holds everything together by the sound of his voice or whatever. And they're like, well, there's sound waves and molecules and holding, I'm not in a place where I've studied enough to be able to say I'm going to rule out the fact that God has a hold on everything within creation, right? I'm not going to say like he doesn't. But I would say the understanding of what miracles would look like and how easy it would be to even understand miracles, if God is on a molecular level holding on to everything, trying to explain or understand how miracles works becomes extremely easy at that point. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of like moving stuff, disappearing stuff. It's kind of like, it's understandable. Now, if you have the viewpoint that God is interacting with all of physical creation at one point in time, you have the idea of omnipresence. But that's only a certain viewpoint.
Well, okay, but I'm not going to go into that one and stuff, but let's say argument number 2 is simply that I do not think that is how the Bible talks about God or describes him. Okay. And my point here is not that you can't arrive at certain conclusions derived from scripture, but my point is, by and large, I think the scriptural evidence is counter to the majority of omnipresent arguments. So in other words, I think the overall scriptural evidence lends itself much more against the notions of omnipresence as people usually talk about it. In other words, the by and large, so there are 2 primary verses that are brought up for omnipresence, right? It's the one from David in the Psalms where he says like, oh Lord, where can I go from you? Rather I descend into hell, or rather I ascend to the heavens, you are there. You know, there is nowhere I can go from you, right? And then the second one is Jeremiah. Yeah, it's Jeremiah, who says, and lo, Lord, you know, is it not you that who fills everything, right? You fill the universe, you know, or God is saying like, do I not fill the universe or whatever, right? So these are the 2 primary ones. One is prophetic, Jeremiah is prophetic, and the other one is poetic, right? So in David's context, at a minimum, it's like, we talk about that in just simply human terms, right? So in other words, I'm just saying the same verbiage can be used, you know, when husbands or wives go off, and we live in a military town. Everyone's familiar. It's like, oh, baby, I'll be with you, even though they're 6,000 miles away, right? They're talking about as though it's like, yeah, I'm with you, right? Now, I'm just saying it's like, that's a normal poetic vernacular that someone can say. And I don't think David really means that much differently in his stuff. He's talking about like, God, you are with me. Where can I escape from you? I can't outgo your sight, or all these sorts of things.
Well, see, this is what me and you talked about before, and this is the reason why I think it kind of depends on how you define omnipresence, right?
Yeah.
So first, I like generally what you've said, because that's part of my argument on me thinking that God exists within time, and I get frustrated on people feeling like the scripture is really clear on like God exists outside of time. I'm like, I really think the Bible doesn't say that. I think it has much more argumentation for God existing within time, currently as time got started. Okay, but on this, it has to do with what it means for God to be omnipresent. So omnipresence, if we mean God is in everything, like literally omni everything, then maybe I would lean more towards just, well, I'm not necessarily saying that, although I think you could make an argument for it. But if we're saying omnipresence as in God exists everywhere but not in everything, meaning not occupying all things, then I would be more apt to say, no, I agree with that. So it's kind of like, to a degree, your presence is here in this room with me.
Sure.
Okay. So God essentially is connected to all of physical reality in the same way.
So
he is aware, sees, and hears, and can interact with all of physical reality.
Yes.
All at once, all the time.
Yes. Totally agreed.
Which, to a degree, can be counted as being present.
Now,
I think that's the argument here, is whether that is.
Here's gonna be my point and stuff. Like, of course, I think it is metaphysically possible for him to be omnipresent. Okay, so like, it's not a problem of possibility. Totally possible. But so getting on to sort of one of the arguments, and I'm going to backtrack to this and stuff, it's like that I would say is like, if he's omnipotent and omniscient, omnipresence is redundant. It's just restating, he's just restating omniscience and omnipresence or omnipotence, right?
Or with omnipotence and omniscience, you automatically also defined that omnipresence is a foregone conclusion. Because anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So now backtracking to kind of what I was saying, my point would be this, right? That how God refers to himself throughout scripture, how he's talked about, he is not talked about as being everywhere all the time. Now, my point is not to say that he couldn't be, but my point is to say the vast majority of scriptures talk about our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be thy name. For I must go and ascend to the Father and send you down the Holy Spirit, right? If I do not go, then I cannot send the Holy Spirit. And the Spirit of God hovered over the waters of the deep. Mm-hmm. And I mean, just over and over and over again, when God is talking about himself, or he's talking about things that are going on, he's referencing himself in places. Now, of course, it's well, is it possible that God is, it's lots of things are possible, but I'm just saying, if you look at the majority of scriptures, when he is talking about himself, it is not referenced, oh Lord, I pray to you who are here and there and everywhere. That isn't a thing.
Here's the issue. Okay. And this, I understand what you're saying. See, I actually think if I was going to argue along your lines, I would also use Old Testament ideas of the tabernacle, of God being in a cloud of fire, a pillar of smoke.
Well, of course.
You would want to use all of these types of things. The issue that I have is this, okay? If you have the coin being every nook and cranny of the world, right? Like this coin exists every little speck of humanity. And you have a being such as me, which is so much bigger than this world, that even though I'm not physically touching this part of the coin,
yeah,
it is within grasp any second, all the time, infinitely. And not only would God be able to see, he'd be able to see both sides all the time. So that's the difficulty, I think, with presence, because when you're like, well, he's not physically there. I mean, he can hear and see and interact with anything, but he's not physically there. It's a difficult, I guess what I'm saying is, we're dealing with a physical reality, trying to explain a spiritual being of infinite magnitude. So it's like, I understand the argument. I just feel like it depends what you mean by being there.
Well, but yeah, I mean, then this is going to go back into the last argument. I wasn't planning on talking about this one subject so much, but one of the other arguments, of course, is this idea of, God fills the temple, God does this, God does that and stuff. And I just don't think I understand all of their language. They use this term manifest presence. That just doesn't mean anything to me. I feel like you're just using empty words at this point. It's not easy for me to understand there's no significant difference they're bringing about. So, and again, and my point is not that other things like this are not possible, but my point is, how does God refer to himself throughout scripture? And when it says, right, oh, and God came and filled the temple. Okay, well, does that mean that he was already there? Now he's just all those semantic arguments I'm just saying, it's I think a very plain reading is perfectly intelligible, and I see no reason not to prefer it as a simpler explanation.
I mean, I think there's nothing wrong with trying to explain it that way. I just think philosophically you end up with omnipresence because of, as you said, it becomes redundant with omnipotence and omniscience.
Yeah,
I think it becomes a necessity. It philosophically leads from those to that one. That omniscience and omnipotence infers omnipresence because of the ability, the interaction with all of reality at all time.
Yeah.
So my general pushback, this is my pushback to your argument thus far, because now you can sharpen it up and stab at other people with it, or me later. Is I would say you have instances where we believe the Holy Spirit is within us.
Yes.
Absolutely. In multiple people at multiple times.
Yeah. So I never understand why people use this as an argument. How is this an argument?
How is this an argument? Because it's obvious that the location of God given in Scripture in one specific time doesn't eliminate his existence in other spaces. So, for instance,
but
the
it's
arrival
clear
of
that the Holy Spirit came, right? Omnipresence necessitates that he never moves.
Where did he come from?
He came from heaven.
Was he not on earth while he was in heaven?
Yes, he was not on earth at some points.
Okay, so let me ask you this. When the Holy Spirit is moving about earth,
mm-hmm.
and he's filling up people with himself and giving them gifts,
yes,
is he bound to one place in physical reality during that moment? He's
not necessarily bound.
He's in multiple areas, right?
That's right.
So
the question is on the other side, though.
No,
can he be in only one location? This is possible?
The debate. This is what I'm trying to tell you. I'm telling you the point of contention right now, because I understand what the point of contention is.
Yeah.
The point of contention is what does presence mean?
Yeah.
The reason why you argue manifested presence, or like a view of it, is because it's saying, well, not all of God is there, right? They're not absorbing or seeing all of God. They're seeing part of God,
mm-hmm.
right?
Sure.
And so the idea is not that God is stuck there because he's there, but that part of his presence is there. The ability to be felt or seen is there.
Yeah.
And so once again, with my definition of presence, not having to be physically located there because you're dealing with spiritual beings, and we don't exactly know how spiritual beings work with space.
Mm-hmm.
We just don't. We have guesses maybe that it's similar. We don't think Satan's, omnipresent, right? But if you have a being
mm-hmm.
that is hearing, seeing, and connected with all of physical reality to a degree, then even when his presence is like seen or experienced in one place,
mm-hmm.
it's almost as if it's kind of like the closest space between two things are like, well, it's the straight line. And then I can't remember what the movie was. It's like, what if the circles actually were moved closer to each other? You have God, which is a being that's like, he's a dot here,
mm-hmm.
that also is like a black hole that leads to every other place in all of reality all at the same time. It's like, because you have to question, here's part of the question. How far away is God if he's in one place versus any of the other places on the planet? Like distance is nothing to an omnipotent being, right? So
totally agree.
That has to do with the idea of presence, right? Because if you're here,
that's the part where you're making I have a claim that I'm not going to agree with.
Right, but that's what I'm saying though, is like, is God in one place? It's like, we could argue maybe that all of his physical presence of his spiritual nature is there, but it's also kind of simultaneously still connected to everything else. So it's not like he's ever farther from any other location in all of the universe.
My question would be this: can God not be in a location?
Can God not be in a location?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I think it, in order for him to be completely absent from something, is what I would have to think.
Partially absent. Can he partially be absent from somewhere?
Can he partially be absent?
Well, like he's not there. Like can he not?
Here's what I have to mean.
Can he not be?
He can be partially not. He would be. It depends what you mean by not there. Meaning, because here's what I think. Mm-hmm. I think that it goes against the definition of who God is if you eliminate a connection to something.
Mm-hmm.
So you would either take away omnipotence or omniscience if he was completely separated from something.
Yeah. Right.
Which means he has to be
there,
connected to it. Yes.
Yeah. So God never moves then, right? You would also say that God never moves. Well, he's because he's everywhere all the time. But he's in every location at all times. So therefore, he actually never goes anywhere.
Let me ask you this.
He just makes himself more present in some places than others.
So once again, we're using a physical reality to try to explain spiritual something, right? So
we're talking about presence.
Well, for me, presence is the interacting, seeing, being connected. Okay, so here's my point. My arm right here, okay? If you looked at it, you might be able to see a small amount of movement, right? Like, is my arm moving? You're like, I mean, it sort of is.
Sure.
But if you're like, okay, molecularly, is my arm moving? You know what I'm saying? The idea of God not moving, I feel like can imply that he's being static, which I feel like is an unfair thing, because it's like, if God's connected everywhere, does he move? Like, sort of. I mean, he moves in the fact that there's action taking place.
Right.
But if you mean like he's jumping locations, maybe. But even in the jumping locations, we're talking about something that is infinitesimally small.
If he's jumping locations, like, that just doesn't make any sense to me to say that he's present everywhere and jumping locations.
Well, this has to do with magnitude, right? This is what I was talking about. So, like, if you're here in this room, we would say you're present here with me.
Sure.
Even without physical contact, we're present because you're able to interact with me physically. You're able to hear me. Okay, but if you're downstairs, we might argue, well, is he present with me? I mean, he's in the same house.
Yeah.
Right? But if you're in the same room, nobody argues you're present. Even though you're across the room. So you see that we're dealing with a physical space to determine whether you're present, because the farther away you are, the farther away we're like, okay, he's not present because there's a certain amount of distance. But when you're measuring distance with an omnipotent being that also is aware of everything, distance doesn't even matter. I guess that's the part of the point with the presence, because part of the reason why you'd be present here is because you can hear and interact and you're here. But if we were, say, 1,000 feet tall, the distance would be much greater for what we would consider being present with each other.
Yeah. So by and large, though, my point is, like, and I, of course, I'm super pro philosophical arguments, right?
Yeah.
You're making a bunch of philosophical arguments concerning, omnipotence and omniscience and what those things mean. And I totally get those. My point would be this. Yeah, show me some biblical evidence, because I just think there isn't any. Like, those two verses, like, again, we want to take the whole counsel of scripture, and it's going to be a list of verses against omnipresence, and it's going to be 2 verses pro.
Yeah, here's what I would argue for that. I would argue that it philosophically automatically goes that way. I'd say that it theologically automatically goes that way. So I would argue that it's not necessarily doctrinally like, well, the Bible is so clear that it's there, but it infers it.
Yeah.
That would be my argument. It infers it. So, I mean, I could agree with you, that I'm like, okay, I can understand the argument based on what we've seen. But I don't think we completely understand how God interacts with the world. You know what I'm saying? Like, okay, so for instance, we have the creation story, and we have the idea of God coming down into the presence with them. And then you have, this thing that while he's up in heaven, after the fall and everything, even with Cain, he goes, hey, your brother's blood is calling out to me. What did you do? So we say, well, God wasn't present until he showed up to talk to Cain. Or was he present at all with Cain, or was this just like a voice from heaven? When God has just a voice from heaven, what does that mean? Is he present with that person because he's talking to him? Is he not present? Is it? And so that's my point on saying, like, what do you mean by being present? And to me, I'm like, when we're talking about what it means, being able to interact with it, being able to hear, being able to respond, being in contact. I think it seems self-evident that God is that all throughout physical reality.
Right. But again, I think that's an argument that can also be used for my view. And just saying is like, yeah, when we're doing a Skype call or people have phone calls, yeah, we don't say that they're literally with the person, even though they're interacting.
Well, it depends. We could say that they are, and some people would argue, but we also can't physically interact with each other right now. We can only do it verbally and through picture. Yep. But that's the difference with God. You're talking about being able to physically interact.
You could
hear and see, and then you have to go, well, what does it mean to be present? And if you're saying, well, if someone can physically interact with you, can hear everything you're saying and see everything you're doing, are they not present? And that's my argument. Is I would say it makes the person or the thing present.
I don't think that's the case, because you're taking one small leap. You're taking one small leap because you're saying is like, could God do those things? And I'll be like, yes, he could. But until he actually does, I don't think it necessitates that he's actually present. So until he does make an action or whatnot, because saying is like, he could, it is a possibility because he can move instantaneously anywhere in the universe.
Well, I mean, it's not even a matter of instantaneously. It's a matter of multiple things at once. Like, it's not, I mean, I guess that is instantaneous. It's at the same time, multiple things at the same time. My point is that while God is there in the physical presence of Israel, in the fire, in the smoke, whatever, in the tabernacle, he's also still interacting with other people on the planet, I would guess, even though we don't have it recorded.
Sure.
Right? And then, I mean, I guess the argument I would say is like, don't you think it's reasonable that people could feel the presence of God in that moment while he's also there in Israel?
Absolutely.
So my part of my argument,
God's not limited. He's not limited to one location.
Well, that kind of goes to the point of what I'm saying, though, is like, when you're saying, you have these manifestations or these appearances of God, if you're saying it doesn't limit him being present from anywhere else, then it doesn't go to the point on like, well, God is in a specific place.
Well,
I'm saying he's also still in multiple places.
Yeah, but I mean, in which case you would say that he is in those places. Wherever he is where he would be, obviously, right? Now, to me, and my point is to say that you are saying that God is limited. He's limited in the sense that he can't be in one location.
No, I'm saying that he can't be separated completely from something.
Yeah, he has to be everywhere. If he's omnipresent, he can never.
God. By definition of being omnipotent and omniscient is what I'm saying. I think that omnipotence and omniscience automatically implies omnipresence. That's my point that I'm
yes. By and large, I guess, and to some degree, I'm just saying as well as like, Occam's razor just cuts it out. It's omnipresence is not necessary, and so I don't find it necessary for anything. It
depends what you mean, because by definition, what I'm saying is it's automatic.
Yeah. But
so what I'm saying is,
it's automatic.
Saying you could reduce saying it, and sure, you could reduce saying it, but it doesn't make it less true. It's kind of like like if you had an argument for the Trinity, and then there was something like, and all three of them are God, and it's like, it's something that is a natural conclusion. Adding it doesn't make it wrong. You're just saying like, well, those all automatically imply the third. You know what I'm saying? Like, trying to say, well, we can remove the third. Yeah, you could remove it, but it doesn't make it less true.
Yeah.
Depending on how you define.
I do think that it is redundant, though.
Redundant, I might be more willing to agree with.
So I'm just saying like that it's kind of restating what's already there.
Yes,
in another way. You're kind of just restating the omnipotence and omnipresence, or like, I guess you could say that in this context, you could perhaps say that omnipresence is basically one word to describe his omniscience and omnipotence.
You can't, You can't, because omnipresence by definition doesn't mean the other two.
Okay, yeah.
You know
But
what
it
I'm saying?
doesn't.
The two imply that the third exists,
Sure.
because you could conceive of a being that God created that is existent within everything, but doesn't have the power to change anything, right?
Sure. Right. But
But you're
again,
right that the first two make the third one not, and I agree with that. I would agree with that. If you taught someone that God is truly omniscient and omnipotent,
yeah,
you don't need to teach omnipresence. Okay, I agree with you on the redundancy
yeah.
idea.
Yeah. So yeah, those just it's a whole conglomeration of arguments. So, but yeah, so I want to be able to have conversations, yeah, like this, about things like this and other things. There can be things that are more substantive, things that are less substantive. And the other thing that I also think that this serves as a purpose for, is, and it's my other buddy Adam. His name's Adam Green.
Okay.
And I had this feeling and this notion, but he articulated it in a way that I was like, oh my gosh, that's brilliant. And that's to help feed the intellectual hunger of other people.
Yeah, I'm down with this. The only reason why I'm giving a thought is because so you have some people who are potentially intellectually starving, okay?
Yep.
And they need it, right? But you have other people that are intellectually overfed and there's no exercise.
Sure. Totally agree. Totally agree.
So that's the only reason why, is I've spent some time around people who have self-confessed to over intellectually stimulating but not living life, because it's a safe space for them.
Well, they're not
They
feeding.
like jumping into it.
Yeah.
Right. And so then they're not actually doing anything, but they're just jumping in. So
Yep.
I think there's the balance, and it's needed.
So what? I don't think I've ever told you this, because it's relatively new over in the course of my entire life anyway. But that is one of the areas and arenas why I love doing partner dancing so much.
Okay.
Because it is so much more a sensory experiential activity that for me, it's not a great concern to go overboard in as much, because it's not my natural bent. Like, it's just not my natural bent to, overdo sensory experience and all those sorts of things. Like other people, like that's their temptation and their struggle, right?
Yeah.
Is to just be completely immersed in experiences and never actually think about anything, right? But for me, it's very, very liberating, and it's very freeing to be in those environments, because it's so much more that it gets me so much more out of the headspace of thinking about things. Because I can totally go on a complete binger and for just 2 weeks totally think about one theological topic, right? Read every book and listen to every commentary and thinking about the arguments back and forth. That's totally doable and not very difficult to do.
See, this is this is part of the reason why the body of Christ is supposed to work so well together, right? Is because the different giftings, which often are aligned with different passions, are meant to push each other, because you're supposed to be striving to work together, which has the iron sharpens iron, like the clashing stuff, right? So ideally, you have people like you and me, which have the ability to talk about different theological issues that maybe don't interest everyone. But we have the ability to delve into something, and we have the ability to pull other people into a growth in learning and loving in that, right?
Mm-hmm.
But other people in their areas of their giftings, so like, I'm not very handy. I've always wished I was more handy. I'm not super handy. So when I want to help someone, if it's just plain physical labor, it's like, man, I could help you because I'm a big person. 300-pound pastor, right? I'm a big person. So I can physically just help stuff, right? But you need skilled labor. Well, I cannot help you there. But you have other people that are gifted specifically with acts of service, and sometimes they're extremely gifted with just doing stuff. They're skilled with doing things. So like, I've had to learn a couple of new things lately with the job that I have, but it's like each one of us with our different giftings and different passions, have the ability to push and grow each other in ways that we naturally don't grow. Like we naturally grow each other when we strive and live together in ways that we wouldn't normally go.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the great strengths of the body. And I think I've told you this before, but Luke, my oldest, I'm going to say that because maybe people on the video don't know, but so my oldest kid, Luke, he would ask sometimes really deep philosophical questions by accident because he's just wondering. Right. And it's funny because sometimes his Sunday school teacher, someone would be like, well, go ask your parents, like, because I believe it's because they don't know how to actually answer the question. But he goes, hey, Dad, why didn't God make babies to be able to take care of themselves?
Yeah, I love that.
And like I think he asked his Sunday school teacher that, like, go ask your dad. Like, so, and he asked other things. Like one of the other ones he asked his Sunday school teachers, like, so why did God like let sin happen? The teacher, of course, I think they were like, I don't know what to do with it. Anyway, but when he asked me the question about like, Dad, why didn't God just make babies to where they could take care of themselves? I thought about it because it was an interesting question to me. Because obviously we know he could have.
Yep.
Right. And you at least have ducks that are born that can swim. And, you got different creatures that can pseudo take care of themselves by the time they're born. But I think that there's so many things in nature that give us natural lessons that are actually meant to help teach us. And one of the things that I realized is that one of the things that happens with kids is they're so reliant on other people. They have to learn from others, and you have to learn to teach them. And they have to rely on you. And there's a lot of just like, I think there's an understanding that we should learn from children, that we should go into a place where we rely on each other to be able to survive. You have the interdependent idea. Like, you don't want to be dependent in a way that like you can't function without another person. You don't want to be independent to where your life isn't there. It's the interdependence that you agree to strive with each other in a way that builds each other, like the body's supposed to do. So I think part of being a kid and part of watching children is understanding that we're not meant to do it by ourselves. And I don't know. I think there's some interesting lessons we could learn and I mean, lots of people do, but just understanding and looking at kids, it's like, there's a lot of things we can learn from just the fact that kids are kids and they have to learn stuff and they have to rely. And so, anyway, side tangent. I'm not even sure where we were going, what we're talking about. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Oh, feeding the intellectually hungry.
Yes.
So yeah, well, I think that it can really help serve that purpose. And this is what I've said, and I kind of jokingly say it, but I'm also kind of serious. And that's that they're really only usually about 1 to 2 nerds per church. That's usually what I find. There are these 1 or 2 guys that totally nerd out and geek out on all of this stuff, and they're the guy that when somebody else is around and they ask them a question, everyone's just like, oh, are you right? Yeah. Everyone's just cringing, like, oh no, what is he gonna ask me now? Because they don't care. Everyone else doesn't care, and he's gonna ask some ridiculously tough question that they think doesn't even really matter. But the truth is that it matters to him, right? It matters to him.
Yes.
And to be fair, like, actually a ton of the atheists that I met grew up in church, and those were the areas where they started to leave, is when they started to ask questions and they were responded with, well, you just need to have more faith. Well, God is just, giving you challenges. And nobody would actually answer their questions. And and so I think that that's a need for some people.
Well, and I think one is, it is super frustrating because me and you have said this before. I've said this to many people. I'm super frustrated because there's this critique that Christians check their heads at the door, and it's true in a lot of cases. That's why it's so frustrating. There are a lot of anti-intellectual Christians out there, which hurt these types of things. And I think the thing that people need to realize is that every part of the body, every person has a certain function, right? So this comes down to the gifting, the personality, all the different things that come together. So I got a chance to teach on the body of Christ. And so like I had all these analogies and all these things that I really loved using. But one of the ones was like thinking about what part in the body you are. Okay. And then I was like, there are some people in the body that are the nose. Okay. And the problem with the nose is you could walk into a house that is clean, like everything looks good, but like you smell something that kind of smells like a rotting corpse, right? You're like, what is going on, right? And the whole body is like, we got to find what's going on. But when you have someone in a church where there's one person that's like, guys, something is wrong here, or like, we need this, all the other body parts, the eyes go, dude, everything looks good. You know, fingers are like touching furniture, like there's no dust on this stuff, dude. And the nose is like, I smell something. We got to deal with it. But it's the only one.
Yeah.
Occasionally in a church, you have that one person. You're like, why are you so freaking difficult? Why are you like this? And they don't understand that they're there to help the whole body.
Yeah.
You know, each individual part has its thing. And it's just like, you're so difficult because none of us have a problem. But it doesn't mean it's not a problem for the body. It just means only one part happens to be the one that's sensitive towards it.
Yeah. It's a good analogy.
Yeah, I think it's so tough. You know, in that thing, like what you were saying, when you have someone who's in a church and they're like, well, I don't see anyone else that's interested in these questions. And I have these questions and like, I can't seem to get any answers. And there's only a couple other people maybe that are out there, or that there might be one or two people in the church that really care and they have those answers, but maybe they're not in leadership, or maybe they're not connected to other people. You know, the ministry team I was on, I one of the things that I loved, you know, when I was in college, is that a lot of these people in the ministry team had different majors than me. You know, I was a religion major. So it was like, there were certain questions that I was going to be better asking, but we had psychology majors, biology majors, you know, I think we had business and, you know, worship and all these other things. And knowing that, and knowing what these other people knew and what they were good at, if someone asked me a question, sometimes it'd go, do you know who you need to ask? Go ask that person. You know, and that comes down to like being connected in a fellowship too, because when we're not connected, the different giftings don't get a chance to actually work together the way that they should. Because like we said, not everyone needs to philosophically break down a lot of different things. But sometimes you show up with a person and they're struggling with an intellectual hurdle that someone else does need to actually like solve. Like, and Satan wants to use confusion and wants to be like, oh, there's no answers. And really, if you have in your church where people just know each other really well, and they're like, that's a really complicated question, you should go ask this person. And there has to be humility on part of leadership to understand that there's people in the congregation that maybe know things that they don't, you know, because that's, if the church is healthy, I'll put it that way. If the church is healthy, no one has enough time to study everything. Okay. It's bound to be that there's going to be people in the church that know certain things you don't, especially when you go into really specialized questions and fields. So it's just, it does break my heart hearing that type of stuff. And I know that it happens and it's super frustrating. Especially when you hear it and you're like, that's not a difficult question.
I know.
Why didn't anyone answer it? Why did you not get an answer? Yeah, that's frustrating.
Yep. So I definitely think that it can help serve that. And then, it is just for some people that, so honestly, just on the intellectual hunger part, right? Just simple relationships. Because not only that, like for those people, like this is their outlet that they want to engage, talk about, have fun. Like, you know, this is fun, you know? And so I have my good buddy, Andrew, he likes to talk about this stuff, but it sucks the life out of him. Like he's only good for a day or two. Like, and I remember we were talking about all this and he said, yeah, well, maybe like, if I just really dug into it, and like spent like a whole bunch of time like on this. And I was like, dude, you can't do it. I was just like, after 2 days, you're going to be dead. Because he does, he loves it. He's interested in some of these questions, but after a couple days, 2 to 3 days of actually thinking about it, he's beat. He's dead. He needs to go do something else. And you or me or many of the other intellectuals, like, dude, you can binge on it for months. It's just on and on.
Okay. So this is where the teaching thing comes in that I think really matters. Okay, so I was in a conversation with someone and we're talking about intellectual capacity and how that affects growth and movement and learning and how far you can go and, spiritual understanding, all whatever, all the different ways it interacts with. And I was like, well, the thing is like, if you think about people like hardware and software, right? Like everyone genetically, you're given a certain amount of hardware and some people have better hardware than others, and that's just the way that it is. I said, but the thing that impressed me about the Nintendo Switch, it came out with this game, Zelda Breath of the Wild.
Mm-hmm.
And when it came out, people were like, oh man, this is like it's really good. And the file size when you downloaded it, I think when it first came out was like 13 gigabytes. At the time, you had other games, different Call of Duty stuff was like, oh, download's gonna be like 60 gigabytes. Because they didn't spend all the time compressing and getting all the software just right to work with a certain system. And, they're trying to release on different platforms. And the point is that even things that seem like they're intellectually tasking, and it's like, well, it takes a lot of hardware. You got to have a really fast processor and a lot of RAM to be able to deal with these difficult topics. It's not necessarily true if you have really good software. If the software is designed really well, hardware that's not as powerful can run stuff that's more impressive, right?
Mm.
And so people who have the gift of teaching have the ability to pass on information. Sometimes you can take issues that seemingly are extremely complicated
mm-hmm.
and you package it in a way that people who don't necessarily have extremely high intellect and hardware can process it and understand topics. And that's the thing to me is like, some things are like really weighty and it's like, oh man, I'm not a math person. So like if we went really deep in a lot of math stuff, I'd be like, man, I'm going to get lost crazy fast.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes you have a really good math person there and they're like, well, let me kind of explain.
Yeah.
And they just explain it. And you're like, I understand what you're saying. I don't understand how I understand what you're saying, but I do. You just explained something super complicated. When I was, I don't know, 4 or 5. No, probably 5 or 6. But we were riding the car with Uncle Aaron. And I said, hey, I don't understand. When I take this, and we're in the car because we're driving, and he's in the back seat with us. I said, when I take this and I throw it in the air, why is it that it doesn't go flinging to the back? Because we're going forward.
Yeah.
So when I throw it into the air and we're going forward, it should just like zip back. And I was like, why does it not happen? And this is like a 5 or 6-year-old. And he was like, because what you don't know is that everything in the vehicle is moving really fast.
Mm-hmm.
So even though you throw that, because it's in the vehicle, it's moving really fast with the car. And it was like, he explained that so easily to a very young kid. And I was like, that makes sense.
Yep.
There's a ton of people that if I would have asked that question to, would have been like, And so what I'm saying is some of the deep theological things, when you or I understand it and we can break it down, there's a lot of topics that like people are like, well, I can't understand it. And what happens is they're given really crappy software that if you're a really powerful computer, then you'll process it all. It's like some of the books that are written for theology sucks to read because it's written for people with really high processors that can process a lot of stuff. And so for an average person, or even me on a lot of books, and I consider myself like pretty good at grasping this type of stuff, I'm like, I it's not enjoyable. But you get someone sometimes with really good teaching skills, and they just power it down to a place to where the average person goes, man, I understand that. And I always thought that was so complicated. It was so deep. I never thought I'd be able to understand something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's, once again, that comes down to the giftings. Some people are gifted with that ability to break down the word in a way that's understandable to the average person. And I think that that's a great thing. Like Dad used to say, how smart are you if you can't explain it to me?
Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely. But so the other point is just that, I think that it's an area of community for like many people that are intellectuals. They tend to be a little bit more isolationist because they don't have as many strong social skills sometimes, or whatever else, or like this is what they want to talk about, and they just don't have somebody else to talk about it with. So I think that it can help provide some helps in some of those areas as well, just normal community and stuff like that. Being able to talk about ideas. And because you know what, that's what I've always really said about the atheists and those people, is that everyone understands that if somebody loses a parent, right? Let's just imagine you had a non-believer comes to church and they're just like, I just lost my dad, but whatever. The person at the door doesn't say, is like, you shouldn't care about that. All that really matters is Jesus. You need to forget about your dad and just focus more on Jesus, right? Like everyone recognizes that as being extremely discompassionate and
right.
not caring for the person. But the part that I don't think that people realize sometimes is the intellectual who comes and says, where did Cain get his wife?
Yeah.
They're not only asking an intellectual question, they're asking a question that it's something that they've thought about some and they care about. They care about the answer to this question.
Yeah, it matters. It matters to them.
Right. And so it's important. And so when we're dismissive of their question for the honest intellectual, you're dismissive of them. It's not really that much different than the person you just don't care for, their lost family members or other things. So
that's interesting. And it's tough because people have different experiences in dealing with people, but I think that we have villainized non-believers to a degree. So many people fear talking about their faith or talking about stuff because they feel like they're going to hit such strong opposition. And there are people who will strongly oppose them, but a lot of people they're closer to neutral, even as far as listening and talking.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that some people just see them as like antagonistic, or like, well, this person's just, there are people that just, they want to argue, but there are people out there. One of the people that I met in my early 20s talked about there were like these different intellectual questions that they just couldn't get over. And so they were going to church like, oh, I want to believe and I get, but I just don't, there's just certain things I just don't get. And they're like, and someone sat down with them and walked them through each of their questions. And they're like, this makes sense. And they accepted Christ later, because there are people who the intellectual hurdle is the actual hurdle. Mm-hmm. And there's other people that it is the excuse to try to hold off having the conversation.
Yeah.
But sometimes, Christians kind of like, you just need to have faith. It is a very frustrating. The pastor I heard actually on Sunday talked about that as like a negative, like when you just tell people, oh, you just need to have faith. And it's like, rather than being able to explain or be able to walk through something, there's the humility in saying, I don't know the answer. Mm-hmm. Especially if it's one that seems like you're like, wow, that's a really important question. And I don't know. I think the thing is a lot of the questions are ones that have answers though. And I think if we engaged more with people, we'd be a lot better equipped, because I feel like we're going to run into a lot of the same questions over and over again.
Oh, hands down.
So,
but of course, I mean, I've had my own encounters of asking pastors like, oh, what about this question? And they're like, And some of the other one that I hate is, well, there are just some things we won't know this side of heaven. And it's like, that might be true, but that question is not one of them.
Oh, dude, oh man, that's one of my, you hit one of the ones that really gets me. So like, I told you that when I was doing this talk with the Calvinism, non-Calvinism viewpoint, because I'm on a non-Calvinism viewpoint, where we're on this discussion with this person, and they ended up batting with that at the end. They were like, well, we just won't know like this side of heaven. And I was like, unless one of us is right,
Yeah.
in which case we do know.
Yeah.
Unless, you're saying maybe both of us are wrong, but if one of us is right, then we do know. I know right now, Yep. So it was like,
I've actually,
that is an excuse. Yeah.
I've used that argument many times, actually. And it's literally straight from you. Exactly on that notion of, it's like, well, but yeah, nobody really knows the answer. But it's like, how do you know? Maybe I do have the answer.
And this is a great example, because I remember, so in the religion hall, there was like one of the other, he was like a youth major, and I was a youth major too, but mine was like religion specialization. Anyway, so, but we're talking, and he was like, there's just questions you don't ever have answers with, like, where did God come from? And I was like, this is like, I was like, oh, well, I said, it depends on if you're like, if you change the question to where did time come from, and then God precedes time, there's no need for the explanation, because the rule of where did something come from only exists within time. I said, so if you ask where did time come from, it eliminates that. And I explained it a little bit different, but the point is he looked at me and goes, I get, that makes sense. I've never, and he goes, but he was just like, I'm just going to punt, because obviously it's impossible for us to know. And it's like, that is used so often in Christian circles on difficult questions, or what's considered a difficult question sometimes when they don't know, that we give up actually finding answers. And so when it's used as an excuse or laziness, it's very frustrating to me. It's very, very frustrating. The other thing is that one of my life verses, which is a cliche youth pastor, like taught in youth group type verse, is when Paul tells Timothy, I think it's 1 Timothy 4:12, maybe it's 2 Timothy. So forget me not knowing the reference, but it's like, hey, let no one look down on you because you're young, right? And that's, everyone's like, oh yeah, I remember that. But it says, but set an example to the believers in faith, speech, purity, love, and all these things.
Yep.
The thing that always sticks out to me, and the reason why I love that verse, is it basically said, even though you're young, you set the example.
Mm-hmm.
And because one of the things that I witnessed is that whoever people's leaders were, whatever their leadership was, they set that as the bar.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, oh, well, my leader does this, so it's okay for me to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, my leader can't find the answer, so I don't need to find the answer.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, my leader says this, so I say this. Oh, my leader, and it's like, it's never like, in their pursuit of Christ, are they ever willing to go past the leader? Like, maybe you need to set an example for the leader in an area, right? It's like, the leader's not infallible. So there might be an area where you have to lead. So that's my frustration. It's kind of like, sometimes you get this intellectual question, right? Mm-hmm. Like, oh, my friend asked me this. And then the leader of the church goes, oh, well, we're never going to have all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
And you go, oh, well, the leader of my church, that was his answer. So there you go. Instead of going, well, is there answers? And you just stop. You stop right there. I went on it was a small tangent, but I don't know if you remember when Lauren Daigle was interviewed on, it was like one of his talk shows, and she gets asked about homosexuality.
Yeah.
And I'm in the conservative world, right? And so the conservative world blew up, and they were like outraged, like she didn't answer the question. She was like, I just, I don't really know. I don't know enough. I'm not going to make a statement on it. People were outraged. The audacity of her not to make a strong stand, right? And I had a couple of responses for that really kind of got me, because one, I was like, well, one, this is just a young person. She's not a pastor. Mm-hmm. Okay, and she happens to be really talented at singing. So why are you so upset that some Christian, someone who's claiming to be a Christian out there at a young age is asked on live national television this hugely controversial topic, and they're like, I'm not sure. And you're outraged. Why exactly?
Mhm.
And I'll tell you why, is because they have idolized her. Because Christianity has this really bad habit of making heroes out of anyone. It's like, oh, this person has some virtue. They're our hero, and we look up to them. And then they do one thing wrong, and we're like, burn them down, burn them down. And I'm trying to think who it was, because someone was like, oh, cancel culture? Yeah, Christianity, you started that. Like, I remember there was like a whole little thing that was like, no, Christians, do you remember? They were like, well, this person banned them. Oh, this person banned them. But the fact of making heroes out of everyone. So I'm old enough to remember that at one point in time, Britney Spears made a comment, which apparently was untrue, but whatever. She made a comment that she was going to save herself for marriage. Do you remember this?
No.
So it happened. She's like 17 or something, right? Well, I remember all these Christian circles just said, she's our hero.
Mm.
Look, kids, look at Britney Spears as a role model.
Right.
Well, maybe they should have been like, okay, she's not on any Christian platforms. She's not claiming all these different things. Why are you lifting this person up? Because then, of course, then when it came out that maybe that wasn't actually true, it was like, she's the worst, and look at her music videos, and she is terrible. And it was just like, why did you just raise this person up to the celebrity? And it's like Christians do it all the time. And once again, I guess my point is, the reason why I'm bringing this up is this constant elevation of people and then using them as this bar, and then we either tear it down or we just like praise it. And so if you have a pastor, like, definitely like show respect, listen, but like, he's not the Bible.
Yeah.
And he's not God, and he's not perfect, and you have someone like, you get pissed off at like this thing for Lauren Daigle. They pray for her. She was a young person that was unbelievably famous, thrown on a TV show, asked a controversial question. It's like, you don't even know what church she went to. Her church might have a very different answer. You might be really glad she didn't answer the way her church taught her, like, you don't know. Mm-hmm. So it's just like this importance on us taking growth and learning, and us learning the Bible, us learning theology, us learning different things, us investing in wisdom as a personal thing, as a part of growing as a person, as a part of our walk with Christ and growing, versus using the excuses, whether it's using leadership as like the bar, like, well, my leader does this, so like I can do this, or I don't need to do this, Mm-hmm. My leader said this person was the devil, so I don't have to listen to this person. It's like, maybe your leader's right. Maybe that person is like the worst, but you have to also be able to think for yourself, because there's meant to be one mediator between God and man. Mm-hmm. And when you elevate other people like that, you make them your mediator. It's like, I don't need to read the Bible. Why would I need to understand the Bible? I have a pastor. That's what it's for, Mm-hmm. I don't need to study the Bible. My pastor studies the Bible and he tells me what it says. It's like, it's like a cheat code,
Yeah, definitely heard
if
that.
I have to take a test, I'm taking my pastor with me. It's like,
yeah. Cool. Well, let's see.